Privyet Funkers, welcome to part 2 of Jagan, the Toxic Beauty of Desire, where we'll finally be taking apart some key takeaways of what the Jagan manga is trying to tell us about Shintaro Jagasaki's, aka Jagan's, embrace of politeness theory and Chiharu's embrace of chaos theory. Now you're probably wondering, well, a lot of things. But probably more than anything, you're wondering why I have to drag Chiharu into this video about Jagan's relationship with politeness. And the reason for that is that, believe it or not, the Jagan manga's philosophical conflict is about the duality of these two main characters. On the surface, it might not seem like it, but the reason the conflict and ultimately collaboration between Jagan and Chiharu is so compelling is because they start off as complete opposites of each other. Still lost? Okay, let me put it this way. From the beginning to about 2/3 of the Jagan manga, Chiharu is the Joker to Jagan's Batman. Cool. Glad everyone's kind of on the same page. Now before I talk about this dichotomy in depth, let me first talk about politeness theory and how it encompasses Jagan's overall philosophy, it being a greater reflection of Japanese society. Because of course it is. Politeness theory is a social cultural phenomenon first observed and coined by Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson, two British doctors in linguistic anthropology. We'll talk about politeness theory in a bit, but in order to delve into their theory of politeness and its derivatives, we must first understand the concept of face. Face is a concept originally studied by Canadian sociologist Erving Goffman. Dr. Goffman first conceptualized face as the positive self-image one projects onto others when interacting with other people. It wasn't until Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson subdivided the concept of face into two counterparts where we can analyze a broader spectrum of projection. Under the updated literature, the concept got a facelift, so to speak. Haha. Face was divided into positive face and negative face. Positive face referencing the need to connect and be liked as well as to maintain a positive self-image. Negative face referencing the desire to not be impeded, bothered, or imposed upon. Now, one important distinction we have to make is that the speaker always appeals or addresses to one of these two faces, not the other way around. For example, if you're a really diplomatic and stale person and wanted to ask your girlfriend for a blowjob, you could theoretically go about it two ways. If you wanted to appeal to your girlfriend's positive face, you could say, "Hey babe, I just wanted to say you're incredible at giving head, and no one has ever slobbed my knob with the same amount of prowess and Newton meters of torque. You make me so happy and closer to you whenever you make me nut, and I think if you were to do that right now, you'd knock it out of the ballpark." Notice how when you appeal to your hypothetical girlfriend's positive face, there's a lot of flattery and a promise that by completing said task, you will feel closer to your girlfriend and thus offer relational currency. When you speak to someone's positive face, you want them to feel liked, appreciated, and admired. Now if you wanted to appeal to your girlfriend's negative face, you could say, "Hey babe, I know you're busy working on your doctoral dissertation and your grandma died this morning, but I wanted to ask you if you could possibly give me some succola mink right now. You don't have to say yes, and I could definitely go put a grapefruit in the microwave now if you don't have time, so don't worry if you can't." When you appeal to someone's negative face, you want to ensure that that person understands that you acknowledge their autonomy. By stating that there is no obligation and no rush to complete the task, you are signaling that you respect that person's time and you do not intend to impose your will upon them, thus giving them the opportunity to ultimately decide whether or not they want to willfully carry out your request. Positive face and negative face compose the framework of how politeness theory is studied. So now that we got the basics out of the way, let's look a little deeper into this theory of sociological dynamics. According to both Brown and Levinson, face is a universal concept relevant throughout all human cultures and societies, meaning that there are a myriad of different ways in which face is culturally respected or disrespected. Any action that happens to disrespect one of the faces is considered a face-threatening act, or FTA for short. According to politeness theory, it is impossible to not threaten someone's face when delivering an utterance, which is linguistic speak for the shortest unit of information that can be expressed through speech. This means that even uttering the word hello implies the disrespect of one of the faces. In this particular utterance, hello offends the negative face, as it implies a response, something which goes against an individual's self-determinism to keep an undisturbed level of autonomy. Just because everything can be considered an FTA, the study of pragmatics tells us that FTAs exist on a spectrum, and it is imperative to disrespect face on a micro level in order to get any information across. Let's break down specifically what other actions threaten negative face, because with this we'll understand Jagen's dysfunction as a communicator and ultimately understand why his desire for murder is so pronounced. Crazy how quickly things escalated, eh? Anything involving orders, requests, suggestions, advice, remindings, threats, or warnings imply antagonizing the negative face. But like I previously mentioned, politeness theory states that none of these things are inherently bad, and FTAs are crucial for allowing efficient communication within society. This is where Jagen's inability to communicate effectively to civilians, his girlfriend, and coworkers come into play. Jagen, in the first third of the manga, suffers from an over-reliance of mitigated speech. We see Jagen use mitigated speech as early as chapter 1 when he attempts to persuade a group of loud drunks to leave the street and go home. Initially, we'll believe that Jagen is being assertive, ordering them to go home, before we realize that he's actually imagining how he'd rather deal with the hoodlums than how he really acts in the face of adversity. His mitigated speech is exemplified when he says, "Come on guys, I'm just trying to do my job here," taking away the directness of his request and using passive speech. By pointing out that he has to do his job, he is taking away the urgency of what he wants to accomplish and absolving himself of responsibility by indirectly blaming his position of power for having to remove the hoodlums. This is an example of mitigated speech because he is minimizing the impact that his orders have on the hoodlum's negative face. This, of course, being one of the trademark cultural elements of Japanese culture. Mitigated speech is commonly observed when Western companies try to make business deals in Japan and ultimately encounter gaps in mutual understanding. It is common for Japanese businesses to lose negotiation leverage with Western companies due to their cultural tradition to not offend negative face. Usually Japanese companies end up making agreements with Western companies that they themselves are unable to fulfill due to the fact that culturally, instead of flat out refusing by saying, "We cannot adhere to these conditions," Japanese businessmen would say, "It will be very difficult to adhere to these conditions." This indirectness, of course, being registered as an acceptance of terms, albeit with reluctance. Jagen also exemplifies this behavior on the metro when instead of directly telling the boss man to quiet down directly, he mitigates his speech and implies that other people are trying to ride the train. Quietness in trains, of course, being a huge cultural expectation for Japan, so much so as even regarding cell phone usage as a taboo. After all,
in Japan is all about the respect.
We can also see how Jagen's relationship with Yuriko has been irreversibly hurt by Jagen's inability to come in direct opposition to Yuriko's negative face. Jagen having to keep his thoughts about his apprehension towards settling down and living a predictable rat race lifestyle. We don't see him realize his mistake until chapter 137, when we see Jagen finally admit that he should have broken up with Yuriko instead of tentatively dancing around her desires. Ultimately, throughout the story, we see Jagen becoming more assertive and later unhinged when it comes to his indifference to transgress upon people's negative face. Jagen's refusal to join Triple H as an openly known superhero is one of the earlier examples of his assertive FTA transgressions. His breakup with Bell is also one of the pivotal moments in which we see Jagen start to use what is known in politeness theory as bald-on-record communication strategy. Bald-on-record is characterized by straightforwardness and an unwillingness to compromise information for being non-threatening to the listener's face. We can then see how Jagen's communication style progresses throughout the manga in relation to the politeness continuum. This continuum shown here is a 2D spectrum that balances the amount of information provided with the amount of perceived politeness. Here we can see that people who are direct can communicate efficiently while being perceived as rude or crass, whereas people who are considered polite struggle to be understood. Here are a few nations' politeness/efficiency coefficients as shown on the continuum. As you can see, Japan is on the clear end of the most polite and least efficient. Oftentimes we can see how regulating the impact that we have on people's faces can also be counterproductive to our goals and ambitions. It shouldn't come as a surprise then that the entire Jagen plot revolves around the benefits of succumbing to one's actual desires in times of need. Half-fractured humans who are able to embrace their true intentions are rewarded with powers that can assist in helping their goals, whereas when their desires are suppressed out of consideration for others, their powers become restrained. The manga, however, makes a very important distinction between being able to follow one's desires in appropriate circumstances and attempting to pursue one's desires at all costs necessary. This distinction, of course, being illustrated as the difference between half-fractured humans and fractured humans, or people who follow their volition versus their appetition. This being the most important theme of the Jagen manga. We will, however, be looking into the importance of these distinctions in part 3, and see what the Jagan manga is trying to tell us about the importance of human desire, how it plays into the meaning of life, and how it can ultimately ruin us if left unchecked. Fortunately for our main protagonist Jagan, he is able to grow out of his dysfunctional communication style known as off-record and politeness theory, meaning the avoidance of face-threatening actions, swing towards the opposite end towards balled on record, and all without fracturing into the highest possible tier of the politeness theory hierarchy known as myopic selfishness. Myopic, meaning short-sightedness, describes the chaotic nature of unhinged selfishness. I'll explain the relationship between chaos theory and psychology and the relationship to myopic selfishness a bit later. Now, in myopic selfishness, one does not only disregard another person's face, but breaks the scale completely and transcends it from addressing psychological dynamics to addressing even the realm of ethics. Under the yoke of myopic selfishness, one could simply shoot up the other person when in disagreement, and while that being a very rude thing to do, naughty naughty, it would ultimately solve for the conflict at hand, the utterance now being relegated to a few gunshots. See what I'm talking about? Jagan's desire to kill for what he perceives as justice stems from his inability to get anywhere in life while clinging to the lowest rung of the politeness hierarchy, thus making his desire a need to break away from his aversion of dishing out FTAs. Jagan's struggle between his wish to live an exciting life according to his own will without being limited by his adherence to not offend anyone's negative face makes him a boring and uninteresting protagonist during the first third of the manga. Sure, his transformation from tentative shy boy to lord of selfish desires happens through a means of traumatic life or death scenarios throughout the manga, but Jagan's complete switch on the politeness continuum doesn't happen without the help of our favorite chaotic hedonist, the Joker. Chiharu. Chiharu is the representation of the static character whose existence is used in order to change the dynamic character. Though I was unable to find a legitimate literary term for this use of a static character, the concept is a lot more common than you'd think. Think Goku's relationship with most of his antagonists from Dragon Ball. Goku doesn't really change, but the people around him do, due to his innocent demeanor and pure intentions. Thus, I will coin this type of character as being a static catalyst. Chiharu is emblematic of a static catalyst due to the fact that everything he does in the manga, from beginning to end, is due to his myopic selfishness. Chiharu, self-proclaiming himself to be a selfishness supremacist, progresses the plot by creating chaos because of his short-sighted desires. This chaos causes our protagonist Jagan to question the efficiency of his tentativeness and forces him to climb up the politeness hierarchy out of self-preservation. Despite Chiharu being a static character, he is quite interesting because his conflict is not with Jagan, but with society's inability to disrespect face for personal ends. Jagan just happens to be like society in the beginning. Ultimately, we can break down Chiharu's personal antagonist as ideology, whereas Jagan's antagonists are those who stand in the way of reviving Yuriko. So we know Chiharu's selfish and hates those who aren't. But what exactly is his desire, and why does it offer a counterbalance to Jagan? This answer is going to seem convoluted at first, but rest assured, I gave this a lot of thought, and you too will see how it all neatly fits together. So what's Chiharu's desire, you ask? Chiharu's desire is chaos, and anything that exists outside of the realms of chaos is boring to Chiharu, and must be eliminated or changed. According to Chiharu, chaos is what makes the world interesting, diverse, unpredictable, and exciting. So remember how I said that chaos theory is connected to myopic selfishness? Allow me to explain. There are many different disciplines that try to make sense out of the concept of chaos, such as politics, psychology, mathematics, etc. But they all agree on one fundamental truth about chaos, and that's that chaos begets order. Let's examine systems to understand what I'm getting at. The late British mathematician John Horton Conway was famed for his study of systems in the form of game theory. Game theory uses mathematics to solve for complex issues under the constraints of variables or rules, so to speak. For example, using game theory, a supercomputer could solve the game of chess, given that it runs every possible game through simulations until it exhausts every single outcome. Theoretically, that computer could never lose a game of chess because it already knows how to play the perfect game regardless of how good or unpredictable you think you may be. Well anyway, Conway wanted to take this expertise of game theory to create a zero-player game where chaos was the #1 rule. He came up with the game of life. Using basic programming, pixels or cells were given specific rules to follow once they have been purposely placed on a plane. Afterwards, the rules would apply and the pixels would have to adhere to their programming. Here are the basic rules of the game of life, although they do change all the time, depending on the initial programming. Number 1. Any life cell with fewer than 2 live neighbors dies, as if by underpopulation. Number 2. Any life cell with 2 or 3 live neighbors lives on to the next generation. Number 3. Any life cell with more than 3 live neighbors dies, as if by overpopulation. And number 4. Any dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbors becomes a live cell, as if by reproduction. Once the game had begun, the pixels or cells as they're referred to would begin to populate and depopulate according to the conditions in random growth that would appear across the plane. However, after a while, patterns would begin to grow and the game would become increasingly predictable, with many of the patterns existing throughout many iterations of the game. This seemingly random growth thus proved to be more predictable as it increased in complexity. The game of life proved to be an important stepping stone in the early study of systems, and has since been replicated using more complicated rules as processing power in computers increased. But these simulations only proved empirically what the mathematics had been saying so many years prior. Given enough time of randomness, order will always prevail, and complex systems will arise from even the most of all humble beginnings. We don't just have to come up with equations and simulations to see these concepts in action either. Nature operates under the same circumstances, just to a much more complex extent. The theory of evolution also posits the idea that all complex life originated from simple proteins and organisms of increasing complexity, and eventually into a predictable set of systems that were in perfect balance. Ecosystems, being a byproduct of random beginnings, now showed a balance that repeated itself over and over again. That is, until humans with selfish desires and an ability to manipulate their environment according to their temporal needs showed up and fucked up everything. Alright. So now that we explained a little bit about how seemingly random occurrences can produce complex and predictable systems in both simulations and in nature, let's talk about the X factor that produces pure randomness. If chaos is only chaos by name because it spawns order, then what truly is chaos? According to physics, the only true random variable that exists is quantum mechanics. But sidestepping that ugly can of worms that is beyond my ability to explain, let's talk about the other X factor that produces chaos, and that's free will. I don't even want to debate if free will is a real thing or not, because honestly, I'm kind of leaning on the idea that it isn't. But in the context of Jagan, free will is an important concept and a central tenet to Chiharu's philosophy and motivations. So assuming free will is a real phenomenon that flies in direct opposition to game theory and systems theory, we can then see why Chiharu would want to propagate free will. But where is this sentiment coming from, you might ask? If I was a licensed psychologist, which I'm not, I would diagnose Chiharu with the real mental illness of chaos addiction. Chaos addiction is a mental illness that makes the sufferer reject predictability in their daily life. Oftentimes, the afflicted person self-sabotages their plans, procrastinates, and changes their mind at the drop of a hat, according to their immediate desires. The thought of knowing what they're going to be doing tomorrow bothers them, and so they deal with life on a day-by-day basis. Sound like you? Relax. We all have varying degrees of a propensity to incite chaos into our own daily lives without actually making us chaos addicts. But Chiharu really took chaos seeking to an extreme when he and his partner caused over 4,000 deaths during the Bupa City mass fracturing event, and even planned out the creation of an entire theme park to make more half-fractured humans and increase the amount of free will in the world and incentivize selfishness by rewarding desire with unlimited power. Yeah, there's levels to this. Alright, so we understand what Chiharu's desire is. That being that he wants to add enough free will into the monotonous and predictable system that is Japanese society in order to break it. But if you're probably still wondering what myopic selfishness has to do with chaos, in order to explain this, let's return to the game of life. Though the game eventually becomes complex and therefore predictable, in its initial stages the game is actually quite random. The starting point of every cell or pixel can represent true randomness because they are practically free to do whatever they want before they become burdened with the constraints of cells next to them. Once a cell has a neighbor, that cell can no longer do what it pleases and has to respect the rules of the game. Society is very similar to the game of life. The larger the community of people, the more rules need to be put into place in order to not violate one of the major programming rules of this game. For example, one individual who lives alone in a field is free to wield a katana and wave it around without violating any laws, right? That individual can be free to practice free will. However, as the system in which that individual lives in begins to grow, and a shopping mall appears on that field, Katana Guy can no longer wield his sword freely without striking the other individuals now present in the shopping mall, because then he would transgress one of the fundamental rules of the game of life. You can't murder. Therefore, complexity and an increase in population will limit free will and make everyone's behavior more predictable. Individuals can no longer be as selfish as they would otherwise near the beginning of the simulation, once they are multiple generations deep in the simulation. Even small forms of individuality must be calculated, because what could be beneficial today, i.e. stealing a TV at an electronics store, won't be beneficial tomorrow, i.e. going to jail for it tomorrow, thus keeping everyone restrained and acting predictably. And hell, pretty soon society becomes so complex that now we have cultural expectations for which kinds of politeness are socially acceptable and which aren't, and well, so on and so forth. You get the idea. And this is where myopic selfishness comes in. Acting with a complete disregard of face for your selfish desires resets your pixel to its original behavior at the beginning of the game of life. Your disregard for the complex system around you allows your free will to take over and thus restore chaos into the system that is otherwise stabilized over several generations. The element of short-sightedness is what gave Chiharu full freedom to cause the mass fracturing event and unwittingly gave rise to Nomen's Nomen's ambitions to become the system. This is why Chiharu wanted to find other selfish people, as the pursuit of one's desires will ultimately break the complexity of the system and restore freedom and chaos into the simulation. Alright, since I previously established that Chiharu was a static character, let's analyze what caused him and Jagen to join teams. Because Chiharu's ambitions to break the system and make everything interesting again stayed the same. His shift in allegiance from Team Dederland to Team Jagen stemmed by both Jagen's and Nomen's Nomen's change of hearts. Let's start off with Jagen. Jagen started off the story as a slave to the rules of the system, him being so controlled that he was unable to climb the politeness theory hierarchy and make choices for his own benefit. Having been spared by Chiharu during the first encounter by proving that he had the potential to be selfish, Jagen continued his journey of self-actualization to become a more assertive and self-serving person. Though Jagen never abandoned his morals and became a hedonist, he was able to find the balance between self-servitude and altruism that gave him the opportunity to grow as a half-fractured human. His servitude of vengeance towards Mikazuchi became the last straw that broke Chiharu's disdain for Jagen. Nomen's Nomen, on the other hand, developed in the opposite way. Originally, Nomen's Nomen was motivated by his selfish desire to make a kind world, a desire that doesn't seem selfish on the surface, but when we take into account his past and his motivations, we realize that he wasn't much different from Chiharu. Nomen's Nomen's life as a prodigy, Ren Nojo, was filled with boredom and existential dread. Ren Nojo essentially experienced life on God mode, something which everyone with cheat codes has experienced. God mode is fun for about 5 minutes before the lack of challenges in the game begin to bore you and you find yourself asking, what's the point? We can assume that when Nomen's Nomen said he wanted a kind world, he meant it for him. Otherwise, Chiharu wouldn't have given him the light of day. A kind world for Nomen's Nomen, therefore, would have constituted a world where everyone was special and capable of doing amazing things to not make Nomen's Nomen seem like a god anymore. If other people can do amazing things that Nomen's Nomen can't, then they won't ostracize him for being a godlike prodigy. Because Nomen's Nomen's goals coincided with Chiharu's to empower the population with incentives to act like selfish pricks, Chiharu was able to work with him. It wasn't until the power went to Nomen's Nomen's head in chapter 111, when Nomen's Nomen revealed that he wants to change the world and restructure society as a half-fractured human world. At that point, once one replaces one society for another, the entire point of myopic selfishness goes away, and the free return to a state of oppression by working within the confines of another complex system. It's at that point that Chiharu tells Nomen's Nomen that he bores him and only sees him as a mascot, before later leaving Dederland and joining with Jagen. Later, of course, we see Nomen's Nomen try to assimilate everyone in the system as a way to prevent free will, selfishness, and as a result the ability to cause or receive harm. A decision that would ultimately cause the complex system that is Bupa City to become what is known as a solved game in game theory, due to Nomen's Nomen's ability to remove all chance from the game. What's interesting is that Chiharu's switch in allegiance to his arch-rival's team paradoxically signals Chiharu's victory in the story of Jagen. Similar to how the Joker wins at the end of The Dark Knight by corrupting Harvey Dent and forcing Batman into exile, Chiharu beats Jagen and his resolute philosophy of selfishness finally overcomes him. Jagen, we can see at the end of chapter 151, is a broken man. He is the most powerful half-fractured human in all of existence, at the cost of his 2 ex-girlfriends, and completely consumed by his desire to kill, to transcend the politeness hierarchy and act according to his will without any regards for anyone's positive face or negative face. We can't say that Chiharu completely changed Jagen either though. Based on what we know about Jagen's constant demeanor, Jagen and Chiharu weren't so different after all. Chiharu was everything Jagen wished he could have been, but couldn't due to his strict adherence of the off-record rung of the politeness hierarchy. Jagen's restraint of being selfish didn't stem from virtue either, but from a soft control imposed on him from his own society. So if based on how the Jagen manga progressed, and how Chiharu was able to unleash Jagen's inhibitions and beat him, does that mean that this manga is telling us that the society is evil and the only way out of its clutches is to be a selfish psychopath? And the answer is no, not even close. Even though Chiharu proved to be right in criticizing people's selflessness for the benefit of the system, even though he pointed out that chaos was the way to break the change of the society, and even though he caused Jagen to abandon all ambition that did not align with his desires, Chiharu was still wrong. You see, there's still one lesson left that author Keneshiro Muneyuki has been telling us this whole time, and that lesson is going to leave all of Chiharu's philosophies and theories fully fractured.